Pause for a moment. Before you continue listening, before you decide whether this message is for you or not, I want to ask you a question that is both ancient and unsettling. What if your life is not random? Not in its pain, not in its timing, not even in its detours? What if the very struggles you tried to escape were not interruptions, but invitations? Across history, humanity has always wrestled with one quiet mystery. Not whether God exists, but whether we matter within God's design, whether our lives are simply reactions to chance or responses to something far older, deeper, and more intentional than we realize. Many people sense it without knowing how to name it. A pull, a restlessness, a feeling that this life is too precise to be accidental, yet too painful to be meaningless. You may have felt it in moments of silence, or in moments of loss, or in moments when success arrived, but fulfillment did not. This video you are listening to speaks boldly into that tension. It uses striking language, words like chosen, contract, destiny, and purpose. And while such language can feel overwhelming or even controversial, it resonates because it touches a nerve most people carry quietly within themselves. The question is not simply what the message says. The deeper question is why it speaks to so many hearts right now. From a theological perspective, this is not merely motivational speech. It is an echo of ancient ideas about calling, vocation, suffering, and divine intention. Ideas that have been debated by prophets, philosophers, monks, pastors, and scholars for thousands of years. Yet, those ideas are now being re-expressed in modern language shaped by psychology, self-identity, and digital spirituality. So in this series, we will do something rare. We will not rush to praise this message. We will not rush to dismiss it either. Instead, we will slow down. We will listen carefully. We will analyze thoughtfully. We will interpret responsibly, as a theologian would, as a pastor would, as a scholar who respects both faith and reason. We will ask, why does the idea of being chosen feel so powerful? What does suffering actually mean in spiritual formation? Is the concept of a soul contract biblical truth, poetic metaphor, or modern spiritual reinterpretation? And how can a believer engage this message without losing theological grounding? This is not about tearing down belief. It is about deepening understanding, because faith that is never examined often becomes fragile, but faith that is examined carefully becomes resilient. So if you are listening because you feel called, if you are listening because life has tested you, if you are listening because something inside you whispers, there must be more than this, then stay with me. Not to be told who you are, but to discover why the question itself matters. This is not the story of a contract. It is the story of calling. And it begins here. Part 1. Why the idea of being chosen grips the human soul. There is a reason the word chosen carries so much emotional weight. It is not a modern invention. It did not originate on social media, nor was it created by motivational culture. The idea of being chosen is as old as humanity's earliest attempts to understand its place in the universe. From a theological perspective, the concept of being chosen speaks to one fundamental human fear: the fear that our lives might not matter. Throughout history, people have asked the same question in different forms. Why am I here? Why was I born into this family, this time, this body, this set of circumstances? Why do some lives feel marked by struggle while others seem untouched? The language of being chosen answers that fear with meaning. In the Hebrew scriptures, the concept of chosenness first appears not as personal elevation, but as responsibility. Abraham is chosen not because he is superior, but because he is willing to walk into the unknown. Israel is called a chosen people, not to dominate the world, but to become a blessing within it. Prophets are chosen not for comfort, but for burden, often carrying messages that isolate them rather than elevate them. In other words, in classical theology, being chosen is never about privilege alone. It is about purpose that costs something. Yet the modern spiritual imagination often hears the word chosen differently. Today, it is frequently interpreted as personal significance, spiritual uniqueness, or hidden greatness waiting to be revealed. That interpretation is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete. The video you are engaging with speaks directly to this modern hunger. It reassures the listener that they are not ordinary, not overlooked, not forgotten. It reframes pain as proof of purpose and difference as evidence of destiny. This is powerful because many people who are drawn to such messages have experienced deep dislocation. They have felt misunderstood, emotionally burdened, or out of place in systems that reward conformity over depth. When someone says, "You were never meant to fit into small spaces," it resonates not because it flatters, but because it explains a long-standing internal conflict. Theologically, however, this is where discernment becomes essential. In Christian thought, being chosen does not mean being central to the universe. It means being invited into God's work within it. The calling is outward-facing, not self-enclosed. The purpose is not to affirm the ego, but to transform the self in service of love. When the Apostle Paul speaks of calling, he consistently pairs it with humility, endurance, and responsibility. Chosenness does not remove struggle. It often intensifies it. It does not guarantee clarity. It demands trust in uncertainty. This reframes the idea entirely. The sense of being chosen that many people feel today may not be a declaration of superiority, but a recognition of responsibility. A recognition that depth of feeling, sensitivity to injustice, or heightened awareness of suffering often comes with a calling to respond rather than withdraw. This helps explain why the message resonates so strongly with those who have endured pain. Trauma often sharpens perception. Loss often deepens empathy. People who have suffered are frequently more attuned to the suffering of others. In this way, their lives do feel marked, not by favor, but by formation. The video speaks of a life that refuses to settle, a spirit that resists smallness. In theological language, this can be understood as vocation struggling to emerge, not destiny guaranteed, but calling unfolding. It is important to say this clearly. Not everyone who feels chosen is being told they are exceptional. Many are being invited to recognize that their story has shaped them for something meaningful, something that may involve healing, guidance, creativity, or presence rather than prominence. This is why the idea grips the soul, because at its healthiest, being chosen is not about standing above others, it is about being willing to stand for something, and that distinction changes everything. Part 2. Purpose, Pain, and the Formation of the Soul. One of the most compelling claims in the message you are engaging with is this: that pain is not incidental, that suffering is not accidental, that hardship, however unwanted, has shaped the soul for a reason. This idea immediately draws attention because it challenges one of the deepest modern assumptions, that pain is meaningless unless it can be eliminated. Contemporary culture teaches us to avoid suffering, medicate it, distract ourselves from it, or interpret it as failure. Spiritual language that reclaims pain as purposeful feels radical, even liberating. Yet this idea is not new. Within Christian theology, suffering has always been understood as a paradox. It is never celebrated for its own sake, never glorified as good in itself, and yet it is consistently recognized as a powerful site of formation. From the prophets of Israel to the early Christian martyrs, from medieval mystics to modern theologians, suffering is treated as something that can either harden the heart or deepen it. The video speaks of pain as alchemy, something that transforms raw experience into wisdom, resilience, and clarity. While the metaphor is poetic, the underlying insight is theologically sound when interpreted carefully. Pain, when endured honestly and reflected upon faithfully, often reveals what comfort cannot. But here, we must slow down. There is a crucial difference between saying that pain has meaning and saying that God directly causes suffering as part of a predetermined plan. Classical Christian theology makes this distinction clearly. God is not portrayed as an architect of cruelty, scripting trauma for the sake of spiritual growth. Instead, God is understood as present within a broken world, working to redeem suffering without endorsing it. This distinction matters deeply. When suffering is framed as something you signed up for, it can unintentionally place responsibility on the individual to justify their pain, or worse, to remain silent within it. Healthy theology never asks a person to minimize trauma in order to make it spiritually useful. Rather, it acknowledges pain fully and then asks what can be formed through it. The message highlights childhood wounds, broken relationships, and seasons of emotional darkness. These experiences are not rare. What is rare is the willingness to look at them without either romanticizing or denying them. In this sense, the video offers something meaningful: permission to see pain not as evidence of abandonment, but as a place where depth was cultivated. From a pastoral standpoint, this is where many people begin to heal. Not because their suffering is explained away, but because it is acknowledged as formative rather than disqualifying. Scripture consistently reflects this pattern. Figures like Joseph, David, Jeremiah, and even Jesus himself are shaped through loss, betrayal, and isolation. Their suffering does not prove that God planned their pain. It reveals that purpose can emerge within it. This reframes the question entirely. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" the deeper theological question becomes, "Who am I becoming through this?" The video suggests that those who have suffered deeply often carry a unique capacity for empathy, insight, and transformation. This aligns with psychological research as well as spiritual tradition. People who have faced adversity and processed it meaningfully often develop a stronger sense of compassion and moral clarity. However, this is not automatic. Pain does not transform on its own. It must be engaged, reflected upon, and integrated. Without that work, suffering can just as easily produce bitterness or despair. This is why the idea of purpose in pain must always be paired with healing, community, and honesty. Theologically, suffering is not a badge of chosenness. It is a terrain where the soul is shaped, not into something superior, but into something capable of holding complexity, capable of loving without illusion, capable of standing with others rather than above them. This is what the video gestures toward when it speaks of transformation. Not the erasure of pain, but the emergence of depth. And this understanding brings us closer to the heart of the message. Not that pain proves destiny, but that endurance reveals calling. Because what you survive often points toward what you are meant to help others survive as well. And that insight, when handled with humility, becomes profoundly powerful. Part 3. The idea of a soul contract through a theological lens. Perhaps the most striking and controversial idea in the message is the claim that each person entered this life having signed a soul contract with God, an agreement made before birth, outlining purpose, challenges, and destiny. This language is powerful because it offers coherence. It suggests that nothing in life is accidental, that even the most confusing experiences were agreed upon in advance, and that the soul arrived here with awareness and intention. For many listeners, this provides emotional relief. Chaos becomes pattern. Suffering becomes mission, uncertainty becomes confirmation. Yet from a theological standpoint, this idea requires careful examination. In classical Christian theology, the concept of a pre-birth soul contract does not exist. Scripture does not describe human souls as entering into negotiated agreements with God before incarnation. Instead, the dominant biblical framework is covenant, a relationship initiated by God, sustained by grace, and entered into within history, not before it. This distinction is crucial. A contract implies mutual negotiation, clearly defined terms, and reciprocal obligations. A covenant, on the other hand, is rooted in promise, faithfulness, and divine initiative. In the biblical narrative, God chooses, calls, and sustains, often without the individual's prior understanding or consent. When Jeremiah is called, he does not recall signing an agreement. He protests. When Moses is chosen, he resists. When Mary receives her calling, she questions. Calling in Scripture is rarely remembered as something agreed upon. It is experienced as something revealed. So why does the idea of a soul contract feel convincing today? Because it translates ancient theological ideas into modern psychological language. What the video refers to as a soul contract can be more accurately understood as vocation, the sense that one's life is oriented toward a particular kind of faithfulness, responsibility, or contribution. This sense often emerges over time through experience, not recollection. In this way, the contract language functions symbolically rather than doctrinally. It gives people a framework to interpret their lives as meaningful without requiring technical theology. However, this symbolism becomes problematic when taken literally, because it shifts the source of calling from God's ongoing action to a pre-life decision made by the individual's soul. Christian theology resists this shift for a reason. If calling originates in a contract we once signed, then responsibility rests primarily on us to remember and fulfill it. If calling originates in God's grace, then even when we falter, forget, or resist, grace continues to invite and restore. This difference shapes how people relate to failure. Under a contract model, failure feels like breach. Under a covenant model, failure becomes a place for mercy. The video also suggests that specific relationships and hardships were prearranged as part of this agreement. While it is true that theology affirms God's ability to bring meaning from every encounter, it stops short of claiming that God scripts relational harm or emotional trauma as contractual obligations. Healthy theology maintains tension here. It affirms that God is present in every circumstance without claiming God authored every wound. It allows people to seek healing without feeling spiritually obligated to justify what hurt them. From a pastoral perspective, this is not a minor distinction. People who believe their trauma was chosen or agreed upon may struggle to validate their pain or seek help. Theology must always protect the dignity of suffering before it assigns meaning to it. Yet, there is something valuable beneath the metaphor. The idea that one's life has direction, that certain themes repeat for a reason, that talents, sensitivities, and struggles converge towards something meaningful. When understood as metaphor, the soul contract becomes a poetic way of describing divine calling unfolding through time, rather than being remembered from before time. In this light, the language can be redeemed, not as a literal agreement signed in eternity, but as an invitation discovered in history. Not as fate, but as faithfulness. Not as obligation, but as response. The danger lies not in the metaphor itself, but in mistaking the metaphor for doctrine. When interpreted wisely, the idea points not to control, but to trust. Trust that one's life, however fragmented it feels, is held within a larger story that is still being written. And that brings us to the heart of the message's emotional power, because what people are truly longing for is not proof of a contract, They are longing for assurance that their lives belong to something larger than their pain. And that assurance, when grounded properly, can be profoundly life-giving. Part 4. Calling, Gifts, and the Responsibility of Impact. As the message unfolds, it gradually shifts from identity to responsibility. After affirming that the listener is chosen, shaped by suffering, and guided by divine intention, the focus turns toward gifts, abilities, insights, sensitivities, and ways of seeing the world that feel both natural and weighty. This transition is subtle, but important. The video does not simply say, "You are special." It implies, "You are equipped." And in theological terms, being equipped is never about personal elevation. It is about preparation for service. Throughout Scripture, gifts are not awarded as rewards for faithfulness, nor are they proofs of moral superiority. They are given according to purpose. The Apostle Paul describes spiritual gifts as expressions of grace intended for the building up of others, not the glorification of the individual. A gift that serves only the self is not fully realized. This reframes the way we understand the video's emphasis on uniqueness, the ability to communicate deeply, the sensitivity to emotional undercurrents, the impulse to create, guide, or encourage, the capacity to sit with others in pain. These are not merely personality traits. In theological language, they are signs of vocation. The message suggests that some people naturally influence the emotional or spiritual atmosphere around them, that their presence alone can shift perspective. While this can sound exaggerated if taken literally, there is truth beneath it. Certain individuals do carry a heightened relational or emotional awareness. They listen differently. They speak carefully. They notice what others overlook. In pastoral experience, these individuals are often drawn toward roles of caregiving, teaching, artistry, counseling, or leadership, whether formally or informally. Their influence does not come from authority, but from presence. However, this is where another important theological caution emerges. Gifts are not proof of destiny. They are invitations to responsibility. To claim gifts without accountability is to misunderstand them. Spiritual maturity requires discernment, learning not only what one can do, but how and why one should do it. The video frames these abilities as intentional placements by the divine, which aligns with theological thought when understood correctly. God's creative intention includes diversity of gifts. Not everyone is called to the same function, and no single gift defines spiritual worth. Yet the danger arises when giftedness becomes conflated with moral authority or spiritual superiority. The Christian tradition repeatedly warns against this confusion. Even the most gifted individuals are depicted as deeply flawed, reliant on grace rather than strength. This is why calling must always be grounded in humility. If your gifts allow you to influence others, they also demand restraint. If your insight allows you to see deeply, it also requires compassion. If your voice carries weight, it must be used carefully. The video suggests that the listener's transformation will create ripple effects, impacting others in unseen ways. This is not an exaggeration. Human lives are interwoven. One person's healing often becomes another person's hope. But impact is not measured by scale. It is measured by faithfulness, not by how many people are reached, but by how genuinely one shows up. Not by recognition, but by consistency. Not by perfection, but by presence. Theologically, this reframes success. A calling fulfilled quietly is no less sacred than one fulfilled publicly. Many of the most impactful lives in Christian history are largely unknown, remembered not for greatness, but for faithfulness in ordinary places. This is the deeper invitation beneath the video's language, not to step into power as dominance, but as responsibility, not to become exceptional, but to become available, not to chase destiny, but to embody love where you are. When gifts are understood this way, they stop being burdens and start becoming expressions of gratitude. They are not weights to carry alone, but ways of participating in something larger than oneself. And this leads us naturally toward the heart of the message's conclusion. The claim that love itself is the ultimate calling. Because without love, every gift becomes hollow. And without humility, every calling becomes distorted. What remains, then, is not a contract to fulfill, but a life to offer. Part 5. Love as the true center of calling. At the heart of the message, beneath all the language of destiny, contracts, and transformation, there is a single claim that carries the most theological weight, that the core purpose of life is love. This is where the message aligns most closely with the deepest currents of Christian theology. Long before modern spirituality spoke of vibration or energy, the Christian tradition spoke of love as the highest calling, not as sentiment, but as embodied action. When the video says that the listener's mission is to remain in love regardless of circumstances, it echoes an ancient truth. In the teachings of Jesus, love is not an accessory to faith, it is its measure. Every law, every calling, every expression of obedience is ultimately tested by love. Love of God and love of neighbor. This reframes what it means to be chosen. To be chosen is not to be spared from difficulty. It is to be entrusted with love in the midst of it. Love, in this sense, is not passive. It is costly. It requires presence when withdrawal feels easier. It demands patience when bitterness feels justified. It calls for forgiveness not because wounds were small, but because healing matters more than revenge. The video speaks of love as a frequency that transforms environments. While this language is metaphorical, the underlying reality is well documented both theologically and psychologically. Human presence, shaped by compassion, changes relational dynamics. Calm steadies chaos. Empathy disarms defensiveness. Faithfulness builds trust. Love does not erase suffering, but it reframes it. From a theological perspective, love is not simply something we generate. It is something we participate in. Christian tradition teaches that love originates in God and flows through people when they align their lives with that source. This is why love can coexist with grief, strength with gentleness, conviction with humility. The message suggests that the listener's story itself becomes testimony, not because it is flawless, but because it is faithful. This is an important distinction. Testimony in Christian thought is not about presenting a polished narrative. It is about bearing witness to presence, to the fact that one did not walk through darkness alone. Love becomes visible not in triumph, but in endurance. Those who have suffered often love differently. They listen without rushing. They hold space without needing to fix. They understand pain without asking for explanation. This is not weakness. It is formation. Theologically, this reflects the idea that suffering enlarges the soul's capacity. Not because pain is good, but because honesty within pain deepens empathy. When love emerges from such places, it carries weight. This also reframes power. Power is not control. Power is not certainty. Power is the ability to remain open without collapsing. The video claims that the listener is more powerful than they realize. In theological language, this power is not domination, it is faithfulness. It is the strength to remain grounded in love when circumstances try to harden the heart. This kind of power rarely announces itself. It shows up in consistency, in integrity, in presence when it would be easier to leave. Love, then, is not the reward at the end of calling. It is the calling itself. And this brings clarity to everything that came before. The idea of being chosen, the formation through pain, the gifts that emerge through struggle, all of these point toward the same destination. Not greatness, not recognition, but love made visible through a human life. When understood this way, the message no longer elevates the individual above others. Instead, it situates the individual within a network of care, responsibility, and shared humanity. This is where spiritual language becomes ethical, because love, once recognized as the center, demands expression, and that expression becomes the true measure of a life well lived. In the final part, we will draw these threads together, not to offer certainty, but to offer orientation, not to define destiny, but to clarify direction. Because in the end, the question is not whether you signed a contract, the question is whether you are willing to live in love, and that question remains open every single day. Part 6. Destiny, freedom, and the daily choice to respond. As the message approaches its conclusion, it leaves behind the language of origins and turns toward the present moment. The focus is no longer on what was decided before life began, but on what is being invited now. This shift is crucial, because regardless of how one interprets ideas like destiny or calling, theology consistently affirms one truth. Purpose is not fulfilled automatically. It is lived out through daily response. The video reassures the listener that delays, disappointments, and detours were part of preparation. While this can sound deterministic if misunderstood, it can also be read through a more grounded theological lens. In Christian thought, divine guidance does not eliminate human freedom, it works within it. Calling is not a fixed script, it is a relationship. God does not coerce fulfillment. God invites participation. Even those who are clearly called in Scripture retain the freedom to resist, to wander, to doubt, and to return. Destiny, then, is not something imposed, it is something discerned over time. This understanding protects the dignity of the human person. If destiny were rigid, failure would be final. If calling were automatic, growth would be unnecessary. Instead, the spiritual life is described as a process of alignment, moments of clarity interwoven with seasons of confusion. The message speaks to listeners who feel they are standing at the edge of something new, something emerging. This resonates because many people sense that growth does not happen all at once. It unfolds through readiness rather than force. From a pastoral standpoint, this readiness is often cultivated through patience rather than certainty. The video claims that blessings require strength. Theologically, this is true when understood properly. Blessings, especially those that involve influence or responsibility, can overwhelm a person who has not yet developed emotional or spiritual grounding. Preparation, then, is not delay for delay's sake. It is formation. However, it is important to resist the idea that suffering is a prerequisite for worthiness. Strength does not make someone deserving of love. Love precedes strength. Growth follows it. This distinction matters because it keeps grace at the center. The message reassures the listener that they are ready. Not because they are perfect, but because they have grown. Growth in this context does not mean mastery over life. It means increased awareness, humility, and trust. This reframes the idea of breakthrough. Breakthrough is not the absence of struggle. It is the ability to move forward without being defined by it. Freedom, then, is not release from difficulty. It is release from the belief that difficulty negates purpose. Theologically, this aligns with the concept of sanctification, the gradual shaping of a person's character through experience, reflection, and grace. Sanctification is not dramatic. It is quiet, repetitive, and deeply human. The message speaks of burdens being lifted. In spiritual terms, this does not mean that responsibilities disappear. It means that the weight of self-condemnation, comparison, and fear begins to loosen its grip. This is where destiny and freedom intersect. Destiny without freedom becomes fate. Freedom without direction becomes chaos. The spiritual life holds both. You are invited, not compelled. Guided, not controlled. Formed, not forced. This is why the message can end with affirmation rather than instruction. It does not give the listener a task list. It offers a posture, trust, openness, willingness. And that posture is where calling lives. Not in certainty, but in faithfulness. Not in knowing the future, but in responding to the present. In the final conclusion, we will gather these reflections into a single, grounded insight. One that honors both the emotional power of the message and the theological wisdom needed to engage it responsibly. Because a life of meaning is not built on dramatic declarations. It is built on quiet, faithful choices made again and again. And that is where true transformation begins. Conclusion, not a contract, but a calling. As we come to the end of this reflection, it is important to return to the question that quietly guided everything we have explored. What does it truly mean to live a life of purpose? The message that inspired this series speaks in bold, evocative language. It speaks of being chosen, of destiny, of soul contracts signed with God before time began. That language moves people because it reassures them that their lives are not accidents and that their suffering has not been meaningless. And in that reassurance, there is something deeply human and deeply spiritual. Yet when we slow down and look carefully through a theological lens, we discover something even more profound. The power of the message does not lie in the idea of a contract. It lies in the recognition of calling. A contract is fixed. A calling is living. A contract binds by obligation. A calling draws by love. Christian theology does not teach that we agreed to our lives before birth, but it does teach that we are known, called, and invited into a life of faithfulness within history. It teaches that purpose is not something we remember from eternity, but something we discover through relationship. This discovery happens slowly. It happens through pain that refines rather than destroys, through gifts that mature through responsibility, through love that deepens through endurance, through freedom that learns to trust rather than control. The message resonates because many people today are not asking for success. They are asking for meaning. They are not asking to be exceptional. They are asking to belong to something larger than their pain, their confusion, or their past. And theology, at its best, offers that belonging without illusion. It does not promise a life without struggle. It does not elevate one life above another. It does not explain every wound, but it does offer orientation. It reminds us that we are not abandoned in our suffering, that love remains the center of all calling, that faithfulness matters more than certainty, that grace precedes every response we make. If there is one truth worth carrying forward, it is this: you do not need to prove your purpose. You do not need to decode your destiny. You do not need to remember a contract. You are already invited to live with integrity, invited to respond with love, invited to remain open even when life is unclear. Calling is not something you fulfill once. It is something you answer daily. And every day you choose love over fear, presence over withdrawal, faithfulness over control. You step more fully into that calling, not because you were obligated, but because you were loved first, and that, more than any contract, is what gives a life meaning.